Welcome to Historium channel. In today's video, we're exposing heart-wrenching photos from the past, when people suffered in ways we can't even imagine today. I bet this video gonna move you like never before. This photograph shows something that was considered normal justice in 1940. A black and white photograph depicting a public execution, let's say, during the height of World War II. But this wasn't the most shocking thing happening at that time. What you're seeing next was documented during one of history's darkest chapters, Chinese civilians about to face a tragic end by Japanese soldiers during the difficult days in Nanking. The image was captured in 2008 as evidence of these unthinkable acts. And this was just the beginning of what people endured. Inside the camps, survivors had to demonstrate to American soldiers the methods of torture used by guards at the Ohrdruf camp between 1939 and 1945. The reality was far worse than anyone could imagine, but the horror didn't end there. In Rostov-on-Don on Pushkin Street in 1943, this photograph shows a mass grave that tells a story no one wants to remember. These scenes were happening across continents and most people had no idea. Going back even further, in 1912 in northeast Siberia near the Lena River, goldfield workers on strike faced what became known as a tragic confrontation along the Lena. The pattern of violence was already being established decades before the World Wars. This man would later become one of the most dangerous figures in the Netherlands. Anton Mussert, leader of the National Socialist movement, poses with his wife around June 1940. His influence was spreading faster than anyone realized. By 1944, the streets of the Netherlands were filled with NSB propaganda. This photograph shows how completely the movement had taken over public spaces. People walked past these messages every day, and many had no choice but to accept what was happening. After 5 years in a war prison camp, these men's uniforms had become nothing but patches and rags. Some were barefooted, others had makeshift boots that barely kept their feet off the ground. This photograph from 1919 shows the true cost of survival. But the suffering wasn't limited to war zones. In 1937, this group of African Americans waited for food at a refugee camp in Forest City, Arkansas. The Great Depression had created its own kind of desperation. The camps became temporary homes for thousands. This photograph shows people standing outside tents and temporary structures in a flood refugee camp in Forest City between 1920 and 1950. Natural disasters combined with economic collapse created scenes like this across America. California's drought refugees during the Dust Bowl era faced impossible choices. Entire families abandoned everything they knew, searching for work and food in unfamiliar places. The American dream had become a nightmare for millions. During the Great Depression, captured between 1930 and 1945, groups of women like these stood together, finding strength in their shared struggle. Their faces tell stories of resilience that history books rarely capture. Even in London in 1945, women queued for vegetables at shops, served through windows like kiosks. Despite the long lines and rationing, the photographer noted they appeared quite cheerful. Sometimes hope was all people had left. In Atlanta, Georgia, in May 1939, this scene was considered completely normal. A black domestic servant feeding a white child. The power dynamics of the time were captured in moments like these, showing how deeply inequality was embedded in daily life. Going back to the late 1800s, these young Jamaican water carriers were children of enslaved Africans, most born on sugar plantations. They carried water from rivers and wells to supply the great houses and sugarcane workers. Their childhood was spent in service before they could even understand what freedom meant. At the Barataria Canning Company, child labor was the norm. Gertrude Crone was 5 years old. Pauline was 8. Little Mildred Crone, near the center of the photo, was only 3 years old and worked every day, according to her mother. The small boy on the left had just dropped an oyster, probably terrified of the consequences. Between 1908 and 1912, groups of young workers stood outside buildings. Some of these children were incredibly small, their futures already determined by economic necessity rather than dreams or education. In Hartford, Connecticut, in 1909, newsboys gathered on street corners. These weren't children playing games. They were supporting families, competing for the best spots to sell papers to adults, who often ignored their struggles. After a raid over Asia Minor in October 1932, this photograph shows Stanislav Karpinski. The intensity in his expression suggests he had seen things that would stay with him forever. War changed people in ways that photographs could barely capture. In 1918, Emperor Charles I visited Lebanon, Croatia, listening to locals and their complaints. Leaders were still trying to maintain connection with their people, even as empires were crumbling around them. But life also found ways to continue. In 1941, people gathered around tables, enjoying refreshments at an amateur program event organized by the Farm Security Administration. Communities created joy wherever they could find it. The Australian Navy during World War I shows sailors on deck maintaining their duties while knowing that each day could be their last. Their calm expressions hide the tension of constant danger. In mountainous terrain in 1949, military personnel shared a moment of happiness and joy that was frozen in time. Even in the most difficult circumstances, human connections provided hope. Just a quick reminder, if you appreciate this journey through history, consider subscribing to support more videos like this. The nursing staff from Stanthorpe Military Hospital in 1918 posed together, their dedication evident in their professional stance. These women saved countless lives while facing dangers that few people understood. Similarly, nurses from the Isis District Hospital in Queensland, Australia, in 1915 demonstrated the quiet heroism of medical professionals during wartime. Their commitment never wavered, even when resources were scarce. Mrs. Jacob paused beside her van with a group of children helping carry food into their school. As central organizer for Birkenhead Women's Voluntary Service, she carried boxes of bread. The Ministry of Food van was presented by the people of Malta, and despite the rain, hope continued. Bookmobiles in Virginia in 1950 were vibrant parts of community life, bringing literature to people's doorsteps. These colorful, chrome-detailed vehicles symbolized progress and education when TV was rare. They served as mobile libraries and social hubs, fostering literacy and community spirit in an era before the internet. In London during the 1930s, two women with pin curls created a walking library. One wore a two-shelf bookcase stacked with books, while the other held a volume in her gloved hands. Knowledge was being shared in the most creative ways imaginable. A traveling preacher's cart near Belglade, Florida, in 1939 brought spiritual guidance to remote areas. Faith and education traveled together, reaching people who had been forgotten by larger institutions. In San Antonio, Texas, in March 1939, a woman made tortillas in a bake shop. Corn tortillas were a staple food in the region, and traditions continued despite economic hardship. Food connected people to their heritage when everything else seemed uncertain. Near Calipatria, California, in 1939, an open-air food factory weighed peas. Agricultural work continued under the sun, with workers adapting to whatever conditions they faced. The land still provided even during the hardest times. In February 1939, this photograph shows the process of loosening carrots from soil using a plow before pulling them to prevent breakage. Every detail of survival had been perfected through necessity and experience. In 1939, a family gathered to burn heavy stumps after a bulldozer cleared land for cultivation. Starting over meant removing every obstacle, no matter how difficult or time-consuming the process. Two women in Chamizal, New Mexico, in 1940, mixed plaster made of straw and mud to replaster their house. They were literally rebuilding their lives with their own hands, using whatever materials they could find. In 1941, Paula Solbakken and Håkon Nordsveen sawed wood for fuel. With Borghild Solbakken present, families worked together to meet basic needs, and every piece of wood represented warmth and survival. This rarely seen photograph from 1888 shows men splitting logs at the Comstock Mill. The techniques for survival had been passed down through generations, and hard work was the only constant people could rely on. Construction workers in 1940 took a break to drink water, with a large distributing tower in the background. Even the most basic human needs required planning and infrastructure that most people never thought about. In Florida in 1940, construction workers gathered around a stove in their barracks camp after a day's work. They found comfort in simple things, warming themselves and sharing stories that helped them forget their exhaustion. Two very clean young Herefords were attended by Joyce Dixon before entering the show ring in Brisbane in 1940. Agricultural competitions continued, maintaining standards of excellence even when the world seemed to be falling apart. A family photograph frozen in time shows people picking peas in their garden at Flint River Farms, Georgia, in May 1939. Growing their own food wasn't a hobby, it was survival, and every family member had a role to play. Migratory laborers played checkers in front of a juke joint during the slack season in 1941. Entertainment was simple, and community formed around whatever gathering places existed. In Eufaula, Oklahoma, in February 1940, a boy and girl played Chinese checkers on a table. Children found ways to be children, even when adult responsibilities pressed in from all sides. A man played a musical instrument, possibly a fiddle or violin, at a square dance in Pie Town, New Mexico, in June 1940. Music brought people together, creating moments of joy that helped everyone forget their troubles. In May 1941, school children performed in a play at the end of the school term, dressed in costumes on a stage. Education and creativity persisted, giving children hope for futures that seemed increasingly uncertain. A group of school children in 1942 engaged in a play or activity related to cowboys and Indians in a rural setting. Stories and games helped children process a world that adults were struggling to understand. A West Frisian wedding scene from 1942 in the Netherlands shows a traditional ceremony continuing despite the war. Love and commitment provided stability when everything else was changing. Princess Irene's birthday celebration with princesses and friends in 1946 shows that even royalty sought normal moments of childhood joy. Power and privilege couldn't protect anyone from the need for simple human connections. Queen Juliana of the Netherlands, with Princesses Beatrix and Margriet in 1950, demonstrates how families, regardless of status, held on to each other during uncertain times. The royal family faced the same fears as everyone else. This image from Pančevo, Yugoslavia, in April 1941, shows a difficult moment where 36 civilians lost their lives. The photographer Gerhard Gronfeld was so moved by the scene he later said, "These eyes will always pursue me." A religious procession and high mass at the Corpus Christi Church in Buffalo, New York in 1943 shows how faith communities maintained their traditions. Spirituality provided strength when physical resources were limited. In 1940, relatives and friends of a deceased family member walked home from a memorial service. Death was a constant companion, and communities developed rituals to help people process grief and continue living. A photograph from 1935 shows two children and their mother, who looks at them with a priceless smile. Love transcended circumstances, and parents found ways to show joy even in the most difficult times. In 1900, a young girl posed with a dog. The innocence of childhood and the loyalty of animals provided comfort that human relationships sometimes couldn't offer. A woman gave a shower to her cute fluffy dogs in 1952. By this time, people had returned to caring for pets as family members, showing how society was healing from decades of survival mode. A formally dressed man and his wife stood behind three children, two girls and a boy, in this photograph taken between 1930 and 1945. Families maintained dignity and hope, dressing up for photographs that would preserve their memory for future generations. This rare photograph of an innocent family from World War II time captures a moment of normalcy that millions of families were fighting to preserve. A group of people sat on the steps in front of their house around 1941. Home was wherever families could gather together, and front steps became stages for the daily drama of survival. A view of the interior of a house in Pike County, Mississippi in 1935 showcases furniture and decor typical of the period, while a girl likely sewed. Domestic life continued with whatever resources were available. An interior view of the original Lincoln cabin shows the old fireplace in Kentucky in 1891. American history was preserved in simple structures that reminded people of their origins and the progress they had made. A portrait of Andrew Johnson's family standing in front of his sod house in Custer County, Nebraska, in 1892, shows how pioneers created homes from the earth itself. The American frontier required innovation and determination that modern people can barely imagine. When Bill Harley was tall and quiet, and Arthur Davidson was short and talkative, they shared a love for fishing. They rode bicycles to a nearby lake, pedaling up hills. In 1895, they encountered an inventor riding a motorcycle. Inspired by the machine and wanting to make their fishing trips easier, they started building motorized bikes. Then they started a company. They called it Harley-Davidson. The Pioneer's Cabin at Calaveras Big Trees State Park, California, around 1886, shows how people carved out lives in the most unlikely places. Trees that had stood for centuries became homes for families seeking new beginnings. A young indigenous woman holding a baby at a train station around 1930 represents the intersection of traditional life and modern transportation. Her presence at the station suggests a journey between worlds that few people understood. A British Army officer being shaved during a train stop to the Himalayas, from Journal des Voyages in 1908, shows how civilization followed military expeditions to the most remote places on Earth. In 1925, a crowd gathered to witness the arrival of the Satyrus seaplane, with Pamela Cross identified as a girl in the scene. Aviation was still miraculous, and every flight drew spectators who couldn't believe humans had learned to fly. An elderly woman standing in front of the post office with a donkey-drawn cart, photographed by John Thomas between 1870 and 1879, shows how transportation evolved slowly in rural areas. Progress reached different communities at different speeds. A group photo of a sporting party from 1885 captures recreational activities that brought people together. Activities were both sport and necessity, and group expeditions created social bonds that lasted for generations. A photograph of Anton Piep and his wife from 1924 shows a couple whose lives would be shaped by political changes they couldn't predict. Personal relationships continued despite the uncertainty of international politics. A meeting of WSBZ staff regarding the municipal strike in 1988 demonstrates how labor disputes have been part of working life for over a century. People have always organized to protect their interests and improve their working conditions. A scene in a mensa or canteen in 1957 shows a subscriber with incomplete meals, capturing a moment related to food service that reveals the daily struggles of institutional dining. A woman stood in front of a dry cleaning and pressing shop in June 1937, with visible rates from that time period. Small businesses maintained communities, and entrepreneurs found ways to serve their neighbors' needs. A photograph shows the entrance to a movie theater on Beale Street in Memphis, Tennessee, in October 1939, with people standing at the entrance. Entertainment provided escape from daily pressures, and movie theaters became gathering places for shared dreams. A vintage photograph shows the exterior of the Hôtel du Midi in Lourdes, France, with multiple stories and balconies. People and horse-drawn carriages filled the street, showing how tourism and pilgrimage brought communities together. Ethel MacDonald, a farmer's wife, tied her horse to a post on Main Street in Drouin, Victoria during World War II. Rural life continued with traditional methods even as the world modernized around them. A crowded auction hall between 1900 and 1930 shows people seated and standing, observing the auctioneer. Commerce continued in traditional formats, and auctions brought communities together for both business and social interaction. A group of people gathered around a campfire in an amphitheater setting in 1955. By the mid-1950s, recreational activities had returned to normal, and people could enjoy simple pleasures without the constant threat of war or economic collapse. A family of 6 backpacked in 1962, likely on a day trip. With backpacks and outdoor clothing, recreation had become more accessible, and families could explore nature together as a leisure activity rather than a survival necessity. A man and woman worked on a piece of wood in Therese, Bistrica, in 1961. Traditional crafts continued alongside modern technology, and people maintained connections to ancestral skills. A group of men stood in line at the opening ceremony for the General's Highway in California in 1935. Infrastructure projects provided both employment and hope for the future during the Great Depression. A photograph shows men standing around a plaque during a dedication ceremony related to the National Geographic Society in 1926. Scientific exploration and documentation had become sources of national pride. A dedication ceremony for the General's Highway included Grandpa Welch and a man named White in 1926. Community leaders were celebrated for their contributions to progress and development. President Calvin Coolidge stood next to a large tree during a dedication ceremony in the 1920s or 1930s, with other people present and a sign visible. Even presidents participated in ceremonies that connected government to natural resources and conservation. A group of people stood around each other in Romania in 1944. By the end of World War II, communities everywhere were trying to rebuild connections and find reasons to hope for the future. If you haven't subscribed yet, you might never see this channel again. So make sure you're subscribed and get more videos like this.